merakamkan penghargaan kepada barisan panelis yang berbahagia Profesor Datuk Dr. Daniel Jayasuriya, Datuk Dr. Madeline Burma dan Tuan Zulkifli Johar serta penraju sidang Saudari Nur Afrika Tajudin atas wacana yang signifikan dan membuka mata sebentar tadi. Hadirin hadirat yang bersatu padu sekalian, kita akan memasuki sidang yang kedua. Oleh demikian, saya menjemput moderator Saudari Nur Amirah Syahrin bagi meneraju sesi sidang kedua dengan topik wacana Malaysia at the Crossroads, Quo Vadis. Untuk makluman semua, sidang kedua ini akan dilangsungkan dalam bahasa Inggeris. Dengan sukacitanya, sidang kedua bermula.
Kita satu bangsa, kita satu negara, kita satu agama.
Thank you, Mr. Master of Ceremony. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera and good morning to everyone. I am Nur Amirah Syahrin and I will be the moderator for this session. I would like to first thank all for coming to this session, second session today, be it via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. The first session was great and informative and a good start for the day, and we shall continue with the second session. So in this second session, we will be discussing on the title, Malaysia at the Crossroads, Quo Vadis. I believe this is an important topic that we are looking at, taking into consideration the chaotic situation or the current political instability that we are facing here in Malaysia. In this session, we will try to touch upon various issues, if possible, although it's very short in length, it's just a 1 hour session. But yeah, such as upcoming general election, rise of populists globally, the concept of Bangsa Malaysia, will it be a go or a no? And on top of everything, where is Malaysia heading to? As the title of this session is. So today's session is divided into two segments. So for the first segment, the speakers will attempt to focus on question arises around the title topic. And on the second segment is allocated for the question and answer. Or if not, let's do it like this. We can all the audience, if you have questions to the speakers, can straight away type it off at the chat box, so we can raise the question at times. So yeah. So today we are honored to have our two distinguished speakers with us. Both of our speakers are known for their diverse studies on Malaysia socio-political situation and expert of the Southeast Asia politics and issues. We are glad to have both views from the outside and inside with regards to the topic. So before we start the session, let me briefly introduce our distinguished speakers of the day. The first speaker is Professor Dr. James Chin. Professor James Chin is a Malaysian born in Sarawak, currently a professor of ASEAN Studies and inaugural director of the Asia Institute Tasmania, University of Tasmania, Australia. His field of expertise are on the governance issues in Southeast Asia, electoral systems, and competitions, especially in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And as for the second speaker for today, we have Professor Meredith Weiss. Professor Meredith is Professor of Political Science and Director of Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, University at Albany, University State of New York. She has published widely and expert on social mobilization and civil society, the politics of identity and development, electoral politics and parties, institutional reform, and subnational governance in Southeast Asia, with particular focus on Malaysia and Singapore. So without further delay, I would like to proceed to our first speaker for the day. So the floor is yours, Prof. James.
Terima kasih kepada jemputan dari Albany to talk about Bangsa Malaysia. Can you all hear me? Okay, and you can see the slides, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time because I think I would like this session to be more interactive. I'm sure the audience have many questions they want to ask. So I'll just quickly go through my thoughts on this issue of Bangsa Malaysia. I think I will start off by basically looking at the issue through two basic framework. One is the short-term outlook and the other is a long-term outlook for Malaysia. I think for the short-term outlook, it's very clear that Malaysian politics will be unstable and you'll be unstable until the next general election. The only way that we'll get some form of political stability back into the Malaysian system is when we have a very clear winner in the next general election. If we don't get a very clear winner in the next general election, we will still have a political instability. Now, in terms of the next general election, it is my prediction that Sarawak will first go for their own state elections. But unfortunately, the results of the Sarawak state election cannot be used as a barometer for the wider GE15. Sarawakians and Sabahans in general, their voting pattern is not similar to what you find in Peninsular Malaysia. One of the interesting things about the political instability this time, especially from February 2020 last year, is that this political instability is basically due to the fact that we have three core Malay parties fighting out now. And here, of course, I'm referring to UMNO, Bersatu, and KAS. One of the reasons they're fighting is very obvious, is because the vote in the last GE in 2018 in the Malay rural areas where the political power lies is that it was quite interesting. If you look at the percentage, it was basically 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So none of them have a clear advantage over the other. And in the Malaysian system, right, in terms of the core Malay party, if you look at the previous history of Barisan Nasional for the past 60 years, you basically have one core Malay party, but you have a much smaller core Malay parties around. But this time, the all three seems to be equal in terms of electoral support. Now, in the Malaysian system, unfortunately, there's Chinese saying that on a mountain, you can only have one tiger, you cannot have more than one tiger. So what is happening now is that in the Malay mountain, there are three tigers fighting it out. So unless they can resolve this issue, we will have political stability. Now, in terms of the GE15 itself, it is my take that once the GE is held, Sabah and Sarawak will play a very important role. The 58 seats from Sabah and Sarawak in some ways will be the icing on the cake in case, in terms of the politics in West Malaysia, you can't get a clear majority. So they will have to look towards the party in Sabah and Sarawak. And this happened during the formation of the government in 2020. It was very clear that without the GPS support in Sarawak, Muhyiddin Yassin would not have been able to put together Perikatan national government. The other interesting thing, of course, is that in the short term, I think the young people are tuning out of the political process, especially now that the government has decided that they will not lower the voting age to below 18 years old. I think that has created a lot of issues among the young people, and you only have to look at the social media of the young people. This is especially true in the Malay population. I think there's a lot of anger out there. And of course, because we're living at the time of the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, economic recovery is paramount. We know that if you look at past Malaysian political history, right, if you don't have a stable economy, that will lead to all sorts of tensions in the system. Now, in terms of the long-term challenges, I would say that the biggest issue we face is that we really need a debate on what do we mean by Malaysian identity. I think, if you look at the first session, right, basically the whole argument was, what is the Malaysian identity? And I think several key core issues that will have to be discussed, and there must be some sort of consensus. The first one, I would argue that we have to define what is the role of Islam in the political system. One of the problems we have faced since independence is that the definition of Islam in the system was not worded carefully. It says that Islam is the religion of the federation, but other faiths may be practiced. There is a sizable portion of the Malay population who read it as Islam is official religion of the federation. So this is where there's lots of tension in the system. Then, as Madeline pointed out in the first session, there's the historical grievances of Sabah and Sarawak in relation to the Malaysia Agreement 63. Again, I'll argue that that has to be resolved fairly soon. Otherwise, it will fit into things that we are not very comfortable with. For example, successionist movement in Sabah and Sarawak. Now, this has been on the political table since 2008. As some of you remember, in 2008, Najib actually won power because of the MPs of Sabah and Sarawak. Without the Barisan National MPs from Sabah and Sarawak, UMNO would have collapsed. So that's the reason why Malaysia Day was made into a public holiday, and he promised 1 billion additional ringgit, 1 billion ringgit additional funding for development in Sabah and Sarawak. And of course, he never delivered on the money. But the point is that there was a recognition that Sabah and Sarawak is becoming an important issue. And of course, he set up the Special Cabinet Committee on MS63. And when the PH government took over in 2018, they also set up the same committee. And now we have another committee under PN government. So I think this issue of historical grievances, you have to resolve it whether you like it or not. And then, of course, the third thing that you have to decide is that, the issue of pluralism in the Malaysian system and the issue of equal citizenship. Sorry about the spelling mistake there, but, got to deal with it. Now, some people argue that, forget about all this. Let's just go back to Rukun Negara. But I think the way that we have promoted Rukun Negara the last 60 years, it has not worked. So I suppose the first question we have to ask ourselves is it still relevant? Do we ditch it or do we want to update it? Again, I do not want to give my opinions, but I'm just raising these core issues that I think we have to resolve over the long term. I agree with all the other speakers that we really need a common narrative for this country, because right now, if you were to go out there, especially on the social media, there are at least half a dozen narratives about what this country is about. And the reason why we need a common narrative is because the political weight of the social media nowadays. It is in some ways unfortunate that Malaysian politics is now very much driven by social media, like what is happening in the West. If something blows up overnight, right, next morning you see very senior people who are sort of, they have to address this issue because it blew up in the social media. The only suggestions I would say in terms of London challenges that it is my belief that Malaysia needs a generation change, because I feel quite strongly that the current group of political leaders we have are no longer capable of dealing with the sort of rapid changes that Malaysia is facing. We need to shift an entire generation because you look at the political leaders, almost all of them are over 60s. We need to shift them to around the 50-year-old age. Because I think those over 60s are not capable of dealing with the sort of political challenges that Malaysia faces in the long term. Part of it is group team mentality, but a bigger problem is that within that group, the majority of the power holders of that group still see the problem, almost everything that we face politically in Malaysia as a racial problem, which given the fact that Malaysia demography has changed, political culture has changed, that is not always true. There are some issues that is much more complicated, or what we call rainbow colors. And of course, another long-term challenge, which everybody agrees on, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, and that is we need a wholesale change in our education system. Now, so my final comments is very simple. I think there was a lot of excitement when Mahathir announced Vision 2020. We were all sort of moving in the same direction, but the moment he stepped down from office, the whole thing was completely derailed. So since then, we had two different prime ministers coming out with their own version. One of them says it will be developed country by 2030, another one says 2040. But whatever it is, the original vision, I think, is still basically used as template for all the other vision. I think the long-term challenges facing the country, what I've described, is very similar to the sort of issues they face when they dropped the Vision 2020 and also the new economic model. Part 1 report, not the part 2, the one that was adopted, the part 1, the original report. A lot of issues raised there are still relevant today. The problem we have with our bureaucracy and with our political class is that we're very good at making plans. We hire all these wonderful consultants from outside, overseas, what have you. They come in, make a beautiful plan, but we lack the political will to carry out. Somewhere along the lines, once the plan is adopted, by the time it's carried out, it's modified. And because it's modified, the plan cannot go back on its original track.
I guess there was some technical problem, so
Yes.
we
Could
should
be
continue.
somebody's not happy with what I'm saying. So
Yeah. Okay, Prof. You may
are we
proceed.
back online?
Yeah, we are back online, so we may proceed.
Okay. So as I was saying, my greatest fear is that because of all this political kerfuffle in the country, right, we are in a slow decline. And very often, if you're in a political system that is a slow decline, you don't see, you can only see it when you're on the outside. So unfortunately, all the countries around us are running in a much faster race. Example, Indonesia and Vietnam, they're actually running 2 or 3 times faster than Malaysia. So one day we may wake up and find that our country is way, way behind. And one of the symptoms of a declining society is that people are getting out. So one of the really interesting statistics I just want to share with everybody in this session is that most people do not realize that in the year 2018 and 2019, right, the largest cohort of people applying for asylum in Australia. You know, normally you don't apply for asylum unless your country is in a civil war, right? The largest cohort of people applying for asylum in Australia, we're talking about figures 6 to 8,000 people were actually Malaysians asking for protection visa in Australia. And if you read the Malay blogs, the Malay social media, right, there's always people talking about going to work illegally in places like Japan and South Korea, you know, all that sort of thing. Now you have to ask yourself, why are all the young people getting out? And the short answer is because they have lost faith in the system. And this is a very, very dangerous phenomenon because you have collective group behavior happening at the same time. So if this thing is not arrested, then I think Malaysia is heading towards trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. James, for the first session. I guess we were hijacked for a little while just now, so I hope that it's going to run smoothly after this. So yeah, we shall proceed to the second speaker, Prof. Weiss. So firstly, could you please briefly comment on the topic today, Malaysia at the Crossroads, Quo Vadis? And secondly, from your point of view, what does national identity mean in this millennial age? With the growing populist movement, will there still be hope in the nation identity, will it only end up as a racial identity kind of thing instead? So yeah.
So, terima kasih Nur Amira dan juga saudara Faisal dan Adim. Saya minta maaf, bahasa Malaysiaku kurang lancar, jadi mestilah berbahasa Inggris. But it's really an honor to be invited to participate. So in terms of these questions, I do think in some ways Malaysia is at a crossroads, but too much of a focus on electoral politics, on whether it's Perikatan Nasional or Pakatan Harapan or what coalition is in government, in some ways misses the point. And that's part of why it's been quite intriguing and encouraging to hear some of the speeches so far today, some of the discussion in the last panel and the introductory addresses, in as much as it suggests real ideas about different paths forward, of different ways to come up with a new consensus or a new vision of what unity would require or what that might represent in Malaysia. If that's left to a political project for political parties or only for elected leaders, it becomes something that's more about winning political control rather than changing identity. And as we heard right at the outset, you know, identities are complex. Collective identity is malleable, and these are multiple identities that we have at any one time. And so the ways that these interact or the ways that we express these different identities we have really reflect more than simply politics. They reflect deeply held beliefs. They reflect our own understanding of our interests. And it can't be something that's only left to deliberations of what coalition is in government at what point in time, but really requires a longer project of saying, all right, here we are at a turning point. When political change creates, you know, what we term in political science or sociology, a political opportunity structure that's changed. There's a moment at which, because of political breakdown and incomplete reconsolidation, I think it's easier for people to see a moment at which there's space for rethinking and then to move with that. But that brings me to your second question of what national identity means in the millennial age and whether it is conflating with racial identity. I think in some ways the Black Lives Matter protests in the US had strong resonance globally, including in places like Malaysia, in part because, separate from the very specific focus on US politics and US society and the pathologies of racism here, speaking as somebody who has not been able to leave the US for over a year now, that I think that there was resonance to that discourse, and there remains resonance to that discourse in so many places, in large part because it calls into question this idea of where does a racial identity fit vis-a-vis a national identity. And in Malaysia, that question is especially fraught in as much as politics has been consciously structured, purposefully structured along communal or racial lines for so long. The end of the nation state or the end of national identity, though, that's long been predicted or declared, but I do think it's incorrect. We have more mobile, apart from the pandemic, we have more mobile populations now than has ever been the case in the past. I'm shocked by the figure that James just noted of asylum seekers in Australia. But even apart from that, Malaysians are well-traveled, highly global, participate in education systems globally and host people from around the world in Malaysia. The long and medium-term effects of the pandemic remain to be seen, but even so, that's something that can't be fully reversed. The fact of transnational travel, that degree of globalization, though, could just as easily heighten as lessen a sense of national rather than subnational identity. So it may be that people identify more as Malaysian without the ethnic modifier when overseas than when at home. And I haven't seen convincing data. I've seen a lot of data in various directions, but I haven't seen convincing data that millennial or Gen Z Malaysians or others are more likely to substitute a racial for a national identity, or to feel a less strong national identity as something separate from or apart from a racial identity. And so part of that has to do with strong institutions. Some of that has to do with the education system, which I agree could use modifications, but at the same time does serve as a mixing ground, especially higher education. And I think compared with the rest of the region, yes, Malaysia faces its own tensions, but at least it doesn't face the same sorts of populist pressures that threaten to undercut the sorts of institutions that can bring change, as we see in a place like the Philippines or even possibly in Indonesia now, where we have, sort of more of a leader-led, populism as a syndrome entails the undercutting of institutions that undergird politics and that enable participation in different ways. And I think that the firmament is still there in Malaysia. But we can still see a rise or fall in racism or racialism apart from that. And I think some of the suggestions that have already been made today really highlight what may be most useful in terms of how to make sure that there is a sense of a national identity among, those who are growing up today, who are reaching political maturity, who may or may not be able to vote in the next election in Malaysia, but who really are aware of where they fit as Malaysians and as global citizens. So I'll come back to that, but for now I'll just say that it's important to think through what a Malaysian identity represents, or what the value added is beyond a subnational ethnic identity for Malaysians. So what do Malaysians want for themselves, but also for their fellow citizens? And why might Malaysians from across categories value a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation, or how might they distinguish between these different identities? And that's, of course, where an organization like ABIM, which has at its premise an ethno-religious identity in some ways, or at least a religious one, can play such an important role in seeking to really spearhead some of that rethinking of what is possible and what does pluralism mean, or what does national unity and cohesion mean in a place like Malaysia.
Thank you, Prof. Meredith. So Malaysian for Malaysia. So that's one highlighted thing that we can try to look upon. So back to Prof. James. You're mentioning about election. Your core studies is on election. So I have a question of post 2018 general election in Malaysia has brought hope to making a new Malaysian identity, or Bangsa Malaysia. This idea was put on pause or delayed due to the Langkah Sheraton, or the Sheraton move in 2020 that caused a shuffle in Malaysia politics. Until this date, we are still in the midst of a political crisis here in Malaysia. Thus, is there any hope to fulfill the idea of Malaysian identity? And what kind of generation, because you were mentioning just now, the current generation needs to change, and the changes need to come from the education. But what kind of a generation that we need to do or shape, and how to shape this kind of new generation? So yeah.
Thank you very much. Just two quick corrections. What I said was that there needs to be a generation shift among the leadership. I'm talking about getting leader rather than the younger generation. I'm saying that the current group of leaders have run out of ideas about how to handle the sort of rapid political change and social change we face in Malaysia. We need to move it down to people in the 50-year-old range. So I'm advocating for people like Rafizi, Nuruiza, of that generation who I believe should be given a chance to step out and run this country. Your question about GE15, again, my take is slightly different. My take was that GE14 was not about Bangsa Malaysia. It was basically about everybody really hating the former prime minister, especially the wife. People hated the corruption. It has reached such a high level. You know, in Malaysia, we like to say that, you know, we boleh tahan until suddenly we reach the tipping point, cannot tahan anymore. So the last GE was not about Bangsa Malaysia. It was all about, you know, coalition put together by another previous prime minister who bring everybody together because everybody hated the incumbent and the wife. So that experiment did not work very well because I think there was no real genuine cooperation among all the different parties in Pakatan Harapan, because like I said, they came together because they hated the previous guy and because the ideological differences were too wide. But the biggest problem, of course, was that the prime minister, the select, did not want to hand over power. So this is all public knowledge. Now you asked about the next GE. My take is that the next GE will not be held so soon. For a very simple reason that the current prime minister doesn't want to face the electorate, while Bersatu is not in the proper mode. They're basically not ready yet. He will call an election, obviously. He cannot run away from it, but he's not ready yet. So I think it is really interesting that today's summit is also the day when today and tomorrow that UMNO have to decide whether they want to sleep in a sand bed or they want to get out of the marriage, whatever. So I think timing could not be better, but my take is that it is no longer to repair that marriage, that something will have to give, and that it is very likely that he will have to come together with a certain section of UMNO. He will try to hang on to power and delay the election as much as possible. And in the meantime, allow the Sarawak state election to go ahead first. And in the meantime, he will see, you know, what is the mood like in Peninsula Malaysia. Now, in terms of the generation shift, the other reason why I'm pushing, sort of making a suggestion that we really need to lower the leadership in this country is that basically the world that we're living together is very different from the world of the experience of the current leadership. If you look at the current leadership, right, most of them spend their political lives growing up during Mahathir Shadow, 80s and 90s, right? So they have really not experienced any other type of political environment. This is where they'll scholar politics, where they grew up. So that's the reason why I strongly believe that we really need a generation shift. And I also look at the sort of the people coming up in Indonesia, the sort of people coming out in the Philippines. Forget about Thailand. Thailand is in the crisis mode now. But basically, there is a difference. If you can bring in a generation shift in terms of the political leaders in the country, right, you really can move the country forward. But the problem in Malaysia is now, you know, people here play tricks. And unfortunately, in Malaysia, the way to climb the political ladder is through a patron-client relationship. So it makes it a lot harder. So new experiments like Muda, trying to set up a completely new political movement, I think those are extremely important. But again, you know, the older group is blocking it by refusing to register, all that sort of thing. So that's the reason why I say openly that, you know, for lack of a better word, the old people, they run out of tricks already. So they can't survive in this system anymore. Yes, they can ring elections because in Malaysia, elections is not free and not fair. But the problem is that they cannot bring the country forward. So that's basically my point. Thank you.
So, Prof. James, as a continual kind of question, so what is your ideal Malaysia post GE15? Because you were mentioning about the what you call this generation change in leadership. So, what do you see, or what will your forecast be on Malaysia? Post
If
GE15?
my forecast is that if the general election is held in the next 2 years, unfortunately, my forecast is that the voting pattern will be very similar to 2018. In other words, the Malay votes will still be split. Okay, what is the ideal situation? The ideal situation is that if we can form a government together after GE15, the ideal government will be a government majority will be younger people.
Mm-hmm.
There will be more gender balance and also regional balance. That would be ideal, and then slowly we allow the young people to take over the mentorship of this country. That would be the ideal solution. The other thing which is often not spoken about is that we really need to bring more Malay women, not about non-Malay, more Malay women into the political process. For whatever reasons, there are lots of talented young Malay women. I've met them in, coming in and out of Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
They're very good, but somehow when they enter the mainstream political party, when I meet them again in a few years' time, right, they sort of lost their semangat. So there's something about Malay political parties that I don't want to use the word repress, but somehow made them lose their semangat. And either that or they sort of keep the party membership, but they no longer take active part. Because I think there is a great group of young Malay women, sort of untapped political talent, but somehow they're not given a chance. So if we can find a way to bring this group in, I think that will make a profound change in Malay political culture.
Sorry, thank you so much, Prof. James. So moving to Prof. Meredith. So as a researcher on student activism, there is a statement saying that Malaysian students and Malaysians in general are apathetic. So what is your take on this statement, first? Second, as per question posed earlier on the rise of populists, will there be hope in creating a new identity within Malaysia from your observation? Or maybe you have some suggestion on it. So yeah, thank you.
So I honestly don't think that Malaysian students in particular, but also Malaysians generally, are by nature apathetic. I know that that's the common discourse, but I've often been really quite astonished at how closely Malaysians follow politics and politicians, and every whiff of kabar angin, it's just the closeness of attention to rumor and all of that really suggests a quite undying interest in politics and those who enact it. But I've written a whole book about the ways in which higher education and other policies have created that illusion. I term it intellectual containment in that book. It's this very political project of pacifying politically challenging campuses in Malaysia in the late 1960s and early 1970s into the mid-70s, and then there are these sort of waves after that. And some of the people who are responsible for that shift are still active in politics. Some have been, sorry to say, active in ABIM as well. And some have changed their views since then, realizing that, that this is not necessarily the best way. But Malaysian political history, especially among students and other youths, is empirically full of critically thinking, politically active, and highly opinionated actors. So even though there is this sense now of apathy as being correct or common, that's not necessarily true. Moreover, apathy and identity are really different matters. So one can be highly engaged, but with a highly racialized identity, or with a highly pluralistic identity. And one can be an apathetic or largely disengaged racist or racialist. So, and I use those, racist meaning specifically discriminatory, racialist meaning really identifying in strongly racial terms, but not necessarily with a clear hierarchy or prejudice attached. And so part of what makes activism important when we think about these terms, why we tend to conflate them, is what the Italian sociologist Alberto Malucci calls identization, which is the ways in which we develop collective identity. So collective identity, the identity of being, as I explain in the book on student activism, a student as something other than somebody who studies, but as someone who is part of this cohort called student activists. That collective identity develops in part through its enactment, through its exercise. So you develop an identity as, for instance, as Muslim or as Malayu, as something other than an individual identity, but rather as a collective political identity through engaging along those lines. So political engagement, which can include civic education, exposure to current events, activism, but also all sorts of other influences, can do so much to shape political and social collective identity and one's sense of priorities and their degree of agency, how much they feel that they actually can change their circumstances or change their system. And higher education is typically a primary space and time in which that happens. So in the US, for instance, I'm encouraged both by data and by my own impressions that suggest that younger people, so my students, for instance, are more open-minded than older generations in terms of race and religion, as well as gender, gender identity, sexuality, and all sorts of other dimensions. Not just that they're more tolerant, I'm not crazy about the term tolerance, but they're more at ease with those who are not like themselves. They're not just putting up with them, but they actually appreciate and identify with them. But even in the US, we are so far from post-racial or post-gender. I still remember, when Obama was elected and my students all said, oh, we're post-racial. And I said, well, look around the room. Do you really think so? And so, the US, though, has always had a civic nationalist rather than ethno-nationalist premise. The understanding is that American citizenship is not tied officially and not supposed to be even unofficially to a racial identity, that it's an identity based on a shared history and mythology of nationhood and so forth, a set of principles and emblems and so forth. But the body politic, the citizenry of those who were granted citizenship early on was overwhelmingly white and Christian, and until 1920, only men could vote. So many Americans clearly did understand American national identity in ethno-nationalist terms as tied to a racial and religious identity. But I think that it helps that the official narrative has always been more inclusive, even when official practice was far less so. It makes clear what the standard is supposed to be, and that one is falling short if not meeting that standard. But education, especially, but not only higher education, is particularly important for presenting perspectives and opinions and factual information. So everything from stories of heroes from across ethnicities, religions, genders, for instance, or national origin stories, these stories that we tell about their nationhood and our founding parents and so forth, that include or marginalize particular participants in that national story, or theoretical perspectives that accentuate class-based rather than ascriptive, rather than identity, ethnic and other identities that you're born with, interests, to present those, and at a time when people's minds are really malleable, when young people might be exposed to other young people with different experiences and backgrounds, and when they're looking ahead to the sorts of adults they want to be and the sort of world in which they want to live, that's really important. And that's where, as Sodar Jafitri was mentioning earlier, these other pressing concerns arise among youths who are thinking about, all right, we have to live in this world for so many decades more. What are the socioeconomic or climate or other challenges that face us that one ethnic group or one religious community cannot address alone? All right. And so I'll just say just a couple very brief additional points. So part of why I think that this myth that's been so deeply enshrined in Malaysia of apathy, why that's so important is that cutting off or discouraging students in particular from exploring and experiencing ideas and forms of mixing and engagement at that stage is therefore really damaging. And it is also then problematic to curb academic staff in the same ways. That's part of why this constant discourse in Malaysia and concern with academic freedom and intellectual autonomy is really pressing, because these are the individuals who are most salient in exposing young people and those with inquiring minds and active, critical agendas really to think. But I do also think that it's worth stressing, and this is something that Dr. Madeline mentioned earlier and Dr. Sri Nazir mentioned, the need to develop narratives from the ground up rather than just a top down. And I mentioned this earlier, but Dr. Sri Nazir's proposal for a new national consultative council type of idea is very good, but one can't mandate tolerance, let alone real respect and appreciation. So to make acknowledgement and understanding of common issues that transcend or circumvent race to make that permeate throughout the population requires a united front and requires more than just political posturing or electoral strategy. We see that reflected in electoral choices, but it shouldn't just come from there. And that's where, again, civil society, as others have mentioned, is so critically important.
All right, thank you, Prof. Meredith. So let me check whether there's question from the floor. I guess everybody is at awe with all the data and also points that have been thrown by both our speaker for this session. So yeah, there's a question from Halmi Ideas. So the first question to Prof. James. Prof. Chin, can you comment on the relevancy of race-based political parties? How do we overcome this long-standing issue policy-wise? And how do we convince or incentivize the political elites on the discourse of Bangsa Malaysia?
Okay, thank you very much, Hami. If I know the answer to that question, I will be living outside Malaysia. I'll be living a good life in Malaysia. I think it's very difficult because the way the political party is structured in some ways reflect the wider society, because obviously you structure a political in such a way that you can mobilize for votes. So if you mobilize in a non-racial way, you can't get the votes. Obviously, you go back to the way that you mobilized earlier. So it is very difficult. I think much more important is the policy side, which is that while you can have political parties mobilizing along the racial ethnic lines, in terms of the government itself, they should make policies that reflect the multiracial population and promote interracial cooperation rather than promote policies that is seen as racially biased towards other communities. So I think in terms of political parties, I don't think there's much we can do there. But I think once they get in the government, they should sort of veer towards the middle. What we have now is that, unfortunately, people in government now, right, for whatever reason, they used to go in the middle, you know. Now they sort of stay on either side of the political spectrum. So it could be they're positioning themselves for the next general election, but I don't think that's the reason. I think a lot of them really do believe that this racial approach is the only way to run Malaysia, which is unfortunate.
And I believe there's another question for you, Prof. James. So Bangsa Negara Malaysia, is it still a polemic or being a branding for corrupted politicking approach? The lack of natural acceptance on things and articles gazetted in Malaysia Federal Constitution by some of few clusters of communities might be the real grassroots problem. Civil society discourses was first introduced in 1970 after the crisis of 13 May 1969. So what's your take on it?
Okay, so I think the concept itself of Bangsa Malaysia, the interesting thing is I think everyone agrees to it. I think what is really interesting about Malaysian societies, I'm talking about all the different groups, if you were to ask them questions that don't seem to be political, they're quite happy. So for example, you ask, is it a good thing that we live in blended neighborhoods where you get Chinese, Indian, Iban, Kadazan, all this sort of thing? They will say it's very good. Is it very good that in a food court we have all sorts of foods from all over the world and all different parts of Malaysia? They say it's very good. The laksa from Penang is very interesting. The laksa from Ipoh, Johor is very different, so we enjoy that. So when it comes to living in a multiracial society, all of them will agree that this is actually a very good thing. It's a strength. But somehow when we come to talk about political rights, political power, that sort of thing, then they sort of withdraw. They become a bit more conservative. So in some ways, right, Malaysians are interesting that they all like this idea of a multiracial, multi-religious country, you know, Muhibah, living harmony, all this sort of thing. But they just can't agree on the political structure. How do we structure in such a way that, you know, we are all quite happy in the system? Because the reality is that the non-Malays in this country, I don't want to use the word grievance, but they're unhappy with what they perceive to be a system that doesn't give them a leg out. So they always feel that, you know, we have to work twice as hard because the government has marginalized us. So if you have that sort of narrative happening in the non-Malay population, right, for so many generations, I think over the long run, it's not good for the country. I think what we want is we want a country where we all say that, yes, we are all Bangsa Malaysia, we're all Malaysians. There are problems in the system. We may have to help certain groups because we need to pull them out, but we really should not be playing a racial game. And this is why I talk about the policy aspects of it. But the problem is that in order to implement that part of it, you need political will. Like I said, we're very good at making plans. If you look at the sort of plans that we produce, it's beautiful compared to other countries that also became independent in the 1960s, right? Malaysia is way ahead of plans. And, you know, we build beautiful plans, we translate it beautifully in Bahasa Malaysia. So we publish it in volumes after volumes, you know, and yet somehow during the implementation phase, things go wrong and the politicians always make excuses. So, you know, I don't know what is the solution. I've been thinking about this for many years. All I know is that I enjoy going to different parts of Malaysia. I enjoy the local food in different parts of Malaysia.
And also not to forget Laksa Sarawak, Professor.
Yes, Laksa Sarawak.
Because I saw on your Twitter you mentioned on that.
Yeah.
So thank you, Professor, for your response. So now we are going to Prof. Meredith. Halmi is posing a question to you. Can you see any social movement in Malaysia occupy public space and build pressure into a critical mass to mobilize? How do we strategize the various frustrations into taking up Bangsa Malaysia as a credible alternative?
Yeah, so I think there are real examples of this. It's a great question, and partly because it's really useful to think back on when this has happened. So we have historic examples in Malaysia of social movements really taking over public space in all sorts of ways. So around socioeconomic issues, for instance, in the early 1970s, of issues of the rights of squatters or penaraka bandar, and that continued on for decades actually, or around small farmers, rubber tappers, and so forth. And so some of those sorts of campaigns highlight issues that are not defined by any one community as defined by political parties, but rather that cut across those issues by those identities by looking along class or other lines. And we can see some at least reasonably successful efforts around environmental concerns, for instance, or anti-corruption. And more recently, we have, of course, bersih as the, sine qua non of Malaysian cross-community engagement that really did change the public sphere in important ways. But I think part of what often can be, and I will say also any number of really interesting and diverse arts initiatives that also can bring communities together, that help to promote different messages, that engage across age cohorts as well, which can be quite useful. But I do think that there have been what I would identify as the overarching dilemma for Malaysian civil society. And the reason that we don't see more of these sorts of cross-cutting initiatives is that civil society tends still to be so sharply segmented into a Malay Muslim and an everyone else camp, usually glossed as, secular, or some will say just Chinese or Chinese and Indian, but whatever, it's a Muslim and non-Muslim essentially. And there are groups that cross those lines or individuals. But at the same time, so long as there is that segmentation, it will be more difficult to see a Bangsa Malaysia as really the guiding identity. And when we've seen the most exciting or promising initiatives, it's often been when we do cross those in Malaysia. So if we think of in 1999, it was when Islamist and secular groups come together in Adil, which becomes, or Enggerak, which becomes Barisan Alternative, channeling this cross-communal energy towards political change. Didn't succeed at that point, but that's really what tips off this long-term incremental process of achieving a new sort of politics and new political possibilities in Malaysia. I think that's part of what happened as well with bersih, despite the fact that there have been these different, once civil society aligns with and participates in electoral politics, it becomes subject to those contests and pathologies as well. So that can be a challenge. But I think perhaps, the way forward in terms of bridging that divide is that it probably has to be the groups, the communities with most to lose by collaborating, which is those who are currently on top in the system, which is to say Malay, Muslim Malaysians who really need to take the initiative in reaching out and agreeing to engage with others, not believing the stereotypes of, oh, this group is acting in bad faith, or this community is out to get something, but rather identifying a common purpose and proactively reaching out. And again, I think this is why it's so important in particular that it's ABIM that's really spearheading this Bangsa Malaysia initiative, because it has a specific sort of gravitas to come from, for an initiative like this to come from ABIM. And it also simply signals a willingness to take the risk of disrupting a hierarchy in which one is privileged. And that's a difficult thing to do.
Thank you, Prof. There's another question. This is for both speaker. So some say that GE16 will be the real era for change, since Undi 18 will be fully implemented. If both speakers can share thoughts on that. So, yeah. So,
James,
Prof,
I'll let you go first.
Oh, you want me to go first? Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so I think it's too early. The reason I say it's too early is because we don't know what's going to happen in GE15. And we haven't resolved the issue. One of the issues I raised very early on is that in terms of Malay politics, who's going to be the dominant player in Malay politics? So that hopefully will get a clear answer in GE15. So until we know that answer, it's very difficult to try to second guess what GE16 will look like. The other thing is that things are moving so fast in Malaysia nowadays, especially politics. I think only somebody who's a real gambler will try to second guess. But what we can say is that bringing in the more than 3 million new voters into the system, that will profoundly change the youth wing of all the main political parties, the mainstream political parties. And if MUDA is registered or MUDA goes into some sort of coalition with Warisan, that will be a major game changer as well.
Yeah, I agree with James about the difficulty of trying to predict now, and I'm terrible at predictions. But I think on the one hand, it will matter that there'll be just this incredible wave of new voters finally registered. And also just the simple fact of having been disenfranchised much more actively than the sort of passive disenfranchisement of not having changed the law might encourage a higher rate of voter registration. Well, it'll be automatic, but then participating in the election after that point. But the other factor is the other end of the age continuum, which is to say that a lot of the key players in Malaysian politics now are, quite elderly, and some of them will possibly leave the political stage by that point. And that opens a door where, yes, there can be, I saw some comments in the chat about the ways in which political parties, reflecting James' comments about Malay women, for instance. Yes, there are tons of women in Malaysian parties, and you'll find UMNO branches that are majority female, and you find women doing all the groundwork in Wanita and Muslimat and so forth, and in the women's wings of other parties. But that doesn't mean that they're chosen to stand for office, or that they reach the highest ranks within the party proper, rather than being in a wing. And the same is true for younger members of the party, regardless of gender. Such that it's very difficult to play an active leading role in a Malaysian political party if one is younger, just because there's not a lot of rotation, there aren't term limits and so forth. And I should say, as somebody in a country with a very elderly president as well, this is not a problem unique to Malaysia. But if, by 2 GEs from now, I do think it more likely that there'll be at least some more turnover. The other factor that I think will make this next GE15 more of perhaps just a refiguring the puzzle rather than actually reaching a more enduring different solution or equilibrium is, on the one hand, the way that the current government was formed and its chronic instability since that time. This has not been a really cohesive, stable government, to say the least. It's lasted, it's been able to accomplish some things, but at the same time, and it's been ruling by, emergency now. So it's just not a sort of normal political moment in that sense. So it's hard to say that it's an incumbent versus a challenger rather than simply reconfiguring. But then the other key factor is COVID-19, which is to say that so much of what happens, how the election takes place, whether it's possible actually to have ceramah, all of these different things may be so sui generis for this next election that I don't think it'll be really representative. And it may just be more a reflection of the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic than really underlying political attitudes and how they might have changed.
Great, thank you, Prof. Meredith. So we have come to the end of this session. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers who are with us today, despite us being in widely different time zone. So we would also like to thank the members of audience who are with us in this session. So we are looking forward to meet all of you at the third session. So thank you. Back to Master of Ceremony.